In November of 2006, two women walking along a dirt access road in Egg Harbor Township, a small city on the outskirts of Atlantic City in southeastern New Jersey, stumbled upon the body of a woman lying face down in a drainage ditch. This woman, who would later be identified as 35-year-old Kim Raffo, was just one of at least 4 women who had gone missing from the region in the weeks prior. Police were called to the scene and quickly discovered the bodies of 3 more women. 20-year-old Molly Jean Diltz from Blacklick Township, Pennsylvania, 42-year-old Barbara V. Brighter from Huntington Valley, Pennsylvania, and 23-year-old Tracy Ann Roberts from Bear, Delaware. All 4 women were sex workers living and working in Atlantic City, and all had blonde or dyed blonde hair at the time of their deaths. The circumstances of their deaths were also eerily similar. They had been dumped, fully clothed, into a drainage ditch behind a stretch of motels along a stretch of roadway known as the Black Horse Pike. The only exception was that all 4 had their socks and shoes removed beforehand, and none showed any sign of physical or sexual trauma before they had died. The remains of Molly Jean Diltz and Barbara Brighter, the first 2 known victims of this unknown killer, were too decomposed to determine a cause of death. Tracy Ann Roberts and Kim Raffo, however, were believed to have been killed within just a few days of their bodies being found. For Tracy Ann Roberts, her cause of death was listed as asphyxiation. Kim Raffo, who had been seen alive just a day or so before her body was found, had been strangled to death. All 4 victims had been laid face down into a drainage ditch, with their faces posed to look east. This, along with the known cause of death for 2 out of the 4 victims, gave rise to a nickname to this region's unknown killer, a nickname that sticks to this story nearly 2 decades later. This is part 2 of the Eastbound Strangler. From the beginning of this story, back in the winter of 2006, there was a pervading belief that this crime had been committed by someone local to the crime scene. That belief has not faded with time, based on what we know. For starters, we know that the ditch where the 4 bodies were found was located next to an access road for a municipal utilities authority's sewage pipe. It was not likely that an out-of-towner or a tourist would know about it, or risk dumping bodies there without some kind of local familiarity. Joe Glassy, Egg Harbor Township's deputy mayor at the time, told reporters with the Press of Atlantic City. But a very key thing, that isn't a road any out-of-town person would know is back there. It would have to be somebody that knows that area. It's not an area a stranger would just wander into and place bodies. That sentiment was shared by noted NYPD Lieutenant Vernon J. Gebberth, who spoke to the Philadelphia Inquirer just days later. The killer has picked this area for his dumping ground, and it means that he is very comfortable being in the area. The information so far tells me the person is from the area and is very familiar with it, and this was a convenient spot for him to dispose of the bodies, but far enough away from where he actually lives to not make him an immediate suspect. In the days and weeks after these victims' bodies had been found in Egg Harbor Township, just a few miles outside of Atlantic City, those that knew them tried to find some answers. Since police were operating their own official investigation rather privately, these loved ones weren't able to find much in the way of personal resolution through it, so they decided to try and find answers their own way. Sadly though, it seems like the victims' lifestyles had led them to become overly paranoid and private, sharing little information with anyone outside of their own immediate circle. Even then, those that knew the 4 victims well, that worked and lived alongside them in Atlantic City, weren't able to provide much helpful info. Since the first 3 victims, Molly Jean Diltz, Barbara Brighter, and Tracy Ann Roberts, had all been missing for at least 1 week at the time their bodies were found, information in their cases was pretty scattered. And even in the case of Kim Raffo, who had gone missing just a day or so before her body was found, information was spotty at best. Someone who had been with Kim shortly before she initially disappeared said that she had been seen getting into a white van driven by a white man. Later, a woman named Pam would step forward, claiming that she had been with Kim shortly before her disappearance. She said that they had been working together and were both approached by a couple of black men driving a green van, who brought them back to the Sunset Motel in Atlantic City. There, she reportedly found out that her client, who employed the two men in the van who picked her up, was an Irish-looking guy who stood about 6 feet tall and weighed approximately 200 pounds, with auburn hair and a small mustache. This man reportedly rented 2 rooms at the Sunset Motel, located near the Golden Key Motel, and told Pam that his name was John. Later, Pam claimed she found out that this man's name was Bill, but more on that later in this episode. Pam says that both Kim Raffo and herself had been hired by Bill and were well supplied with crack cocaine to hang out and party with him over several days. She also claims that at least 2 additional victims were brought in to entertain this man calling himself John, including Tracy Ann Roberts and Barbara Brighter. She says that these women and herself were provided an assortment of narcotics to keep them drugged up. After a couple of days, though, Pam started to grow weary of the company she was keeping and later recalled to the press of Atlantic City. I started to see him change. He started talking about how he was in prison for 15 years for murder and how he just got out 2 months ago. That's when I started thinking something was wrong. It was weird. He was saying he doesn't like white girls. Then he was picking up our clothes and smelling them. He picked up Kim's bra and was saying it smelled bad. After 2 days of these strange behaviors, Pam decided to leave. Kim Raffo reportedly stayed. But later, when Pam came forward with this claim, she was already standing trial for prostitution charges. So it makes it hard to make heads or tails from her confession, since it was later learned that she was promised to be released from jail early if she helped out with the investigation. There's a reason why many doubt jailhouse confessions, with any evidence based on incentive being inherently hard to trust. However, this is also indicative of how much trouble this case was for investigators. Almost everyone that they interviewed had character flaws that were hard to look past, or provided information that was sketchy at best because the people involved lived sketchy lives. That's why I find it hard to really criticize any of the investigators in this case. From the moment they inherited the investigation, there was already a credibility issue with most of the witnesses. Later, a man named Bill Schlew stepped forward and told reporters with the press of Atlantic City that he was the John identified by Pam, who, if you recall, she later learned had the name Bill. But in the same statement, he denied killing any of the victims, nor having a sexual relationship with any of them, but did claim that he had known them and had partied with them in the past. We'll discuss him a bit more in detail later this episode, however. Shortly after this story started to unfold along the New Jersey coast, a sex worker from the area named Denise Hill claims that police brought her in for questioning. While not suspected of having any involvement in the crimes, Denise was theorized to have had some significant knowledge of the case due to her proximity to the victims, with her having worked alongside most of them. Denise told reporters that police brought her in to ask her about a prior client of hers, a man with greasy black hair and a scraggly beard. Investigators reportedly showed her a picture of a specific man they were theorizing to be involved, which they had taken with a cell phone camera. For those of you who use cell phones in the mid-2000s, you know that they were far from the industry-standard cameras packed into your newer Apple or Android devices. Yet, Denise confirmed that these men were one and the same. Later, when speaking to reporters, Denise stated that this man had hired her once before, and during their time together told her that he had done terrible things in the past. She described him as really weird, white, with a beer belly, with a beard and mustache. He was crazy. He was talking crazy stuff. He said he killed 3 people, and he was on the run. For a time, it was believed that Charles Ishmael Coles may have been this potential suspect, as he seemed to fit the physical description. Known among residents as Ish, Coles was an Atlantic City resident and a convicted drug dealer with links to at least 2 of the victims. If you recall from the last episode, Coles had lived with Tracy Ann Roberts for a time, and had been in a brief relationship with Kim Raffo at the time of her death. Uniquely, Coles also happened to be Muslim, which was of particular interest to investigators early on. After all, the victims had been found barefoot and facing east, theorized by some to be facing the Holy Land in the Middle East. But this was just a theory. It's hard to tell whether this is still an earnest theory in the case, or was something bandied about briefly back in 2006, when America was still enthralled in the War on Terror and Muslim xenophobia was at an all-time high. Police interviewed Charles Ishmael Coles several times in the early weeks of their investigation, and tried to gather evidence about him from those that knew him in the area. However, he was never charged with any involvement in the case, and has only spoken to reporters sporadically over the years. In the days after the bodies were discovered behind the string of motels along the Black Horse Pike, it was reported that police officers were seen removing evidence from rooms at the Golden Key Motel. Specifically, room 101, where a former crack addict had reportedly been staying up until just a few days before the bodies were discovered. That room, in particular, was located closest to the crime scene. Located at the back end of a hallway, near the rear of the building, room 101's window looked out directly onto the marshland where the 4 bodies were found. There was even a back door that led out to the marsh, and the room itself wasn't visible from the parking lot, a perk that would have allotted a potential killer some semblance of privacy. It was theorized by reporters that the killer could have stayed there, and then easily dragged or carried the victims' bodies into the drainage ditch behind the motel. Suspicion regarding the motel's occupants is a through line that has continued to linger on the periphery of this case over the years. But that suspicion reached peak levels in April of 2007, when it was reported that a former maintenance worker at the motel was suspected of involvement in the 4 murders. That maintenance worker lived in Alloway Township in Salem County, approximately 45 miles west of Egg Harbor Township in Atlantic City. But he had been staying at the Golden Key Motel at around the time the bodies were discovered, and per the motel's owner, had been there for about a month, a time frame fitting the 4 victims' deaths. That's after the break. Terry Olison was the name of the maintenance man being investigated as part of the Eastbound Strangler case, whose life was irrevocably changed after police began investigating him for the crimes. In his mid-30s at the time, Terry Olison had lived in Alloway Township in southern New Jersey for years. There, he lived in his family's home alongside his longtime girlfriend, Vicky Fair, who he had been with, on and off at times, since 1998. Their relationship was troubled, to say the least. The two got into constant loud arguments with each other, and both sides would claim through various family members that the other had been verbally and physically abusive. This contentiousness in their relationship eventually led to a head in the final half of 2006, and they seemed destined to split up for good. At the time, Terry had no family to turn to. Despite coming from a large family with many siblings, he had grown estranged from his family for roughly a decade. That estrangement really kicked into high gear after Terry inherited his family home following the death of his mother. Feeling that they had been screwed out of their rightful inheritance, some of his siblings grew resentful and bitter. It's been speculated over the years that Terry's relationship with Vicky Fair also contributed, with her not getting along with Terry's family. Regardless, in the spring of 2006, Terry and Vicky split up. He decided to go stay for a bit in Atlantic City. Eventually, he ended up taking on odd jobs for the Golden Key Motel in Egg Harbor Township. There he took on various maintenance tasks for room and board, and stayed in room 127, a room which, like room 101, was tucked into a back corner, located diagonally from room 101. There, he stayed for roughly 2 months, and reportedly kept to himself for most of the time. But some dancers at a local strip club recall him, or someone that looked a lot like him, having a short fuse, with Kelly Fusco, a dancer, telling reporters with the press of Atlantic City that this man pushed her during an outburst and, "He said I fucking killed them, and I'll do it again," unquote. This dancer didn't initially tell police about this encounter, but had a bouncer throw Terry out of the club. Both later recounted the story to investigators. Terry reportedly moved out of the Golden Key Motel in December of 2006, weeks after the bodies were discovered, and returned to his home in Alloway Township. It wasn't until the following spring, March of 2007, that investigators began to take a look into Terry Olison's background. They discovered that he had a prior criminal record, but nothing major. In 1993, he had been arrested on a burglary charge, but avoided a conviction by agreeing to a pretrial intervention program. Then, in 2002, he had been arrested alongside his girlfriend, Vicky, for disorderly conduct. In the first week of April 2007, police officers arrived at Terry's home in Salem County and were seen searching it for several hours. They also seized his car and truck, and while he was being brought in for repeated bouts of interviews, authorities declared his home unfit for habitation. But through his lawyer, Marty J. Siegel, Olesen denied any involvement, stating, "Other than perhaps being in the wrong place at the wrong time, there is the possibility that somebody may have suggested to the authorities that he had some involvement." Through the press, Terry Olesen and his family members would begin to insinuate that Terry's now ex-girlfriend, Vicky, had reported him as a possible suspect to police because of his proximity to the case and their ongoing breakup. That statement from his lawyers not so subtly hinted at that as well. While Terry Olesen was never charged with any official involvement in this case, he did end up getting into some legal trouble as a result of the increased police scrutiny. Authorities arrested him in April of 2007, accusing him of invasion of privacy, claiming that he had videotaped his ex-girlfriend's underage daughter while she was changing her clothing back in November of 2005. The camera that had captured this footage had been installed under a baseboard heating grill, and was just one of many cameras installed on the property. Olesen and his lawyers alleged that he was unaware that there was any illegal content recorded on this camera in particular. Authorities claimed that during a search of Olesen's property, they also came upon another disc containing pictures of an unidentified female engaged in, quote, all sorts of sexual activity, unquote, but they were unsure who this was and whether or not she was underage at the time. But considering that no further information came out about this, and no additional charges followed, I can only assume that this was just pornographic content. Following his arrest for the invasion of privacy charges, the Atlantic County prosecutor requested Terry Olesen's DNA and planned to test it against DNA found at the crime scene near the Black Horse Pike. However, at this point, police investigating the Eastbound Strangler case refused to publicly name Terry Olesen a suspect, continuing their habit of stating close to nothing about the case. This would become a major point of contention for Olesen and his lawyers, who argued that the high price of his bail was due to police suspecting him of involvement in the murders near Atlantic City, but at the same time refusing to name him a suspect or even a person of interest in that crime. Instead, he had been jailed on invasion of privacy charges, which usually carried a pretty paltry bail amount. His lawyers alleged that this was a tactic used by authorities to keep Terry Olesen jailed for an indefinite amount of time, during which time he would become desperate and much more likely to be coerced into confessing. During repeated interviews with the media, Terry Olesen would state that police asked him to be interviewed and submit his DNA, along with his truck for possible tire tread impressions. He also stated that he believed him evicting his ex-girlfriend from his home had inspired her to call the police and report him as a suspect, something woman scorned. In response to the police request, Terry Olesen agreed to give up both DNA and hair samples, seemingly nonplussed with the request. However, it seems like nothing came of the results, as the prosecutor's office, who had been heading the Atlantic City case for nearly a year and been steadfastly quiet the entire time, continued to remain so. In October of 2007, Terry Olesen accepted a plea deal for taping a nude teenager, having been held in police custody since April of that year. This agreement would have him serve a maximum of 364 days in jail, to be followed by 3 years of probation. To this day, he has not been charged with any crimes regarding the murders outside of Atlantic City, and for the most part is believed to have been cleared. While police will never admit to clearing any potential suspects or persons of interest, his lenient plea deal, followed up by nearly 2 decades of police silence, indicates to me that even if he did commit the crime, that police have zero evidence linking him to it. In the summer of 2007, as suspicion swirled around Terry Olesen, his lawyers revealed evidence pointing the finger at another man in the still unsolved case of the murdered women from Atlantic City, a man whose name I've already mentioned in this episode, Bill Schlew. According to Terry Olison's lawyer, he had received a call from an inmate at the Atlantic City jailhouse. At the time, Bill Schlew was awaiting trial for aggravated assault and robbery, and heard of Terry Olison's incarceration. Terry's lawyer, James Leonard Jr., later told the Press of Atlantic City that this man, Bill Schlew, reportedly confessed to him the murders of the 4 women. Leonard stated, "He told one of my assistants that he wanted to speak to me regarding making a confession to the murders." James Leonard Jr. and his colleagues met with Bill Schlew inside the jailhouse and claimed that he described visions he was having regarding murders of these women. He indicated in these visions he had choked these women to death. He mentioned he was under the influence of crack cocaine and alcohol and admitted that he possibly blacked out. He indicated that he had a burning feeling in his chest. He referred to my client, Terry Olison, as the Salem County guy, and that he did not want to see an innocent man go to jail. He also indicated that he did not want to go to prison for life or go on death row. Now, before we go off and just assume that Bill Schlew was guilty of committing these crimes, let's take a moment to consider the source. At the time, Schlew was awaiting trial for multiple charges at the time of this reported confession, and per his own verbiage, which in itself was already routed through the lawyer of another possible suspect, this confession was essentially a vision or a dream. I don't know where everyone listening is from, but I don't know what jurisdictions put a lot of credence into either as legitimate evidence. And in my opinion, this hints at some mental imbalances at the very least, which would require treatment, not incarceration, but that's just my own 2 cents. Regardless, visions or dreams are not something that I would willingly accept at face value in a criminal prosecution. It's also worth pointing out that Bill Schlew had a history of drug use and suicide attempts, the former of which indicates potential cognitive issues, and the latter of which indicates emotional volatility, which, when combined, is not a good combo, at least not a credible one as far as confessions go. I'd also like to reiterate that these conversations in jail were not recorded due to limitations on equipment allowed inside, and that the party bringing them to light had a vested interest in deflecting guilt away from their own client, Terry Olison, making them perhaps the most biased party possible. During these initial conversations with Terry Olison's lawyers, Bill Schlew reportedly admitted his guilt in many different ways. Some were explicit, others seemed to be clouded in this vision dream way, but he would give different reports in the weeks that followed. At one point, he reportedly claimed that he had had sex with the murdered women and then killed them. Then, at other times, he would claim the opposite, that they had never had sex and he didn't kill them. In fact, when speaking to the Press of Atlantic City, Bill Schlew stated, "I'm denying I ever said anything about killing them. I don't even know how those girls died." During this conversation, Bill Schlew admitted that due to his prior arrest, authorities already had his DNA on file. So if the killer of those 4 women outside of Atlantic City had left DNA at the crime scene, they'd already been able to compare the 2 together, in which case he was unlikely to have been the killer. In the bail-related hearings for Terry Olison, the initial recorded phone confession from Bill Schlew was submitted as evidence, but discounted by authorities. So it seems like they didn't take him too seriously as a suspect. However, we do know that Schlew did have some prior links to at least 1 or 2 of the victims, having hired them to party with him, but it's possible that there was some exculpatory evidence pointing away from his involvement in these crimes. Regardless, Bill Schlew finally succeeded in taking his own life in December of 2012, and any suspicion regarding him in this case has seemed to fade over time. If he is still a suspect in this ongoing case, then the only authority figure on it would be the law enforcement agencies handling this case, and they haven't made any public comment on it over the past 17 years. As the investigation stretched on for many months, the media attention that had once been fervent began to die out. Local publications would continue to publish refresher pieces to basically keep the word out there about the still unsolved deaths, but there was nothing new to report. Investigators had been rather tight-lipped about the investigation from the beginning, and that would not change over the many months and even years that followed. As I discussed in the past episode, they refused to admit that the 4 women found outside of Atlantic City had been killed by a single serial killer, refusing to admit almost anything or cede any confidential ground in their ongoing investigation. When questioned, officials with the Atlantic County Prosecutor's Office refused to publicly name any suspects or persons of interest, and held firm to their standard of not releasing any information in an ongoing investigation unless they felt it prudent. They had only done that a few times early on, when they had released information about the victims in the hopes of identifying them. This secretive nature did not change when prosecutor Jeffrey Blitz retired in 2007. His predecessor, Ted Housel, continued this policy. The next prosecutor, James P. McLean, was more straightforward, but his answers were frustrating in a different way, by revealing that the potential reason for investigators' silence was simply that they didn't know either. As reported by Fox News in 2015, 9 years after the bodies were found, McLean stated, "This fits the FBI definition of a serial killer. From the facts gathered during the investigation, it could have been a local person or it could have been a transient." It has become apparent over time that investigators don't seem to have had much to work with. Based on what has been reported by retired or unnamed sources from within the police agencies handling this case, it seems like investigators don't seem to know where the victims were killed. It's unlikely to have happened where they were found, outside of the Golden Key Motel, which has since been demolished. That drainage ditch likely served as little more than a dumping ground for the killer or killers to dispose of the bodies. It is possible that they had stayed in the motel or its neighbors at the time, but that remains unknown. All of the theories about specific rooms, such as room 101 or room 127, remain just theories. With that being said, this implies that police don't have a crime scene, nor much in the way of forensic evidence. Hopefully I'm wrong. The victims' bodies were discovered in a drainage ditch, which, as I mentioned in the last episode, was full of runoff containing sewage and chemicals, and likely would have tampered with the available evidence. That's without getting into the exposure and decomposition that the victims' bodies would have endured for days or weeks, or the fact that they had been working as sex workers at the time of their deaths and had likely been close to or intimate with other people beforehand. So the evidence found there might have been spotty at best, even before we factor in decomposition, Mother Nature, exposure, etc. So I think we can establish that at the very least, investigators were operating off of the back foot from the moment that the bodies of these 4 women were found in Egg Harbor Township, New Jersey. But it seems like from the moment the bodies were discovered, their hands may have been further tied by administrators involved in local government. A retired detective from the Atlantic City Police Department claimed that the investigation was squandered in its earliest days, when information was still fresh in residents' minds, alleging that police did not hit the streets during the time frame that the victims' acquaintances would have been out there, late at night or in the early morning hours, and that his unit, the Vice Squad, wasn't contacted for assistance until early December 2006, weeks after the bodies had been discovered. Other police officials would state that the investigation had been carried out in a really haphazard way, with authorities ordering 4 separate investigations to take place, seemingly acting as if each of the victims had been murdered separately from each other. For that reason, their deaths were investigated individually in the early weeks, with authorities not wanting to label this a serial killer case in order to avoid scaring away potential tourists from Atlantic City. One of these police officials later recalled to NJ.com, "They just didn't want to start with the premise that one person did all of this. That was their fatal mistake." It took months for authorities to acknowledge that these 4 killings were likely the work of one person or group, despite the obvious similarities in each, and during that pivotal time, momentum was lost, with different investigative bodies stepping on each other's toes and constantly rediscovering the same information, only to be compared later on. Who knows what might have happened if authorities harnessed their resources in a useful way and investigated these 4 deaths as the work of a single killer from the jump. Who knows, maybe I wouldn't be making this episode nearly 2 decades later. We're gonna pause once more to hear a word from today's sponsors. Over the years, the case of the Eastbound Strangler has been linked to other cases and killers throughout the region. Early on, theories posited that there was a link to some local cases, including the murders of 45-year-old Veronica Field and 43-year-old Karen Luongo, who had each been killed via knife wounds to the throat inside their own homes in May and October of 2006, respectively. However, police stated that there were some stark differences between the cases and that of the Eastbound Strangler, with prosecutor Jeffrey Blitz explaining, "These were people in their homes on North Georgia Avenue. They were cuttings. One was nude in the bathtub. One was African American and one was white. The only similarities were they were female and they were prostitutes." In 2010, when several bodies were found near Gilgo Beach on New York's Long Island, people in the media and in online discussion boards began to float the idea of a link to the Eastbound Strangler from a few years prior. Police themselves even began to investigate a potential link, and these two cases remained loosely tied to each other until just recently. For years, basically as long as we've known about both cases, both police officials and media figures have theorized about a link between the Eastbound Strangler and the Lisk. Lisk being, of course, the Long Island serial killer, or, as locals call him, the Gilgo Beach Killer, the unknown killer of multiple women in the area around New York City. Lisk, as he was known for years, was a serial killer who dumped his victims' remains in an affluent area along Long Island named Gilgo Beach. His case involved at least 4 known victims: Maureen Brainerd Barnes, who was killed in 2007, Melissa Bartholomew, 2009, Megan Waterman, 2010, and Amber Costello, 2010. However, many others have been linked. Missing or murdered sex workers and other unidentified victims whose remains were found close by, on or near Gilgo Beach. The linked victims extend back as far as 1996, but carried on through 2010, just a month or two before the first bodies were discovered. Some theorize that the crimes might have even begun in the early 1980s, and may have continued on through at least 2013, if not even more recently. The Long Island serial killer is a case that I've covered extensively on this podcast. First, through a series of 3 episodes I originally published back in 2016, and then a number of updates from over the years, including one published just a few weeks ago, which included the most recent news of an arrest in that case. In July of 2023, police in New York arrested 59-year-old Rex Heuermann, charging him with 3 out of the 4 Gilgo Beach crimes: the murders of Melissa Bartholomew, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello from 2009 and 2010. He was not charged with the death of one woman, Maureen Brainerd Barnes, who went missing and was believed to have been killed in 2007, but information tying her to Rex Heuermann was included in his charging documents. As I mentioned in the most recent update episode, information in that document is pretty damning. Like to the point where if Rex Heuermann isn't the Long Island serial killer, then he's an incredibly unlucky bastard who is, at the very least, a complete piece of shit. But as of this recording, it seems like he is already well on his way to spending the rest of his life in a box if he's lucky. As I mentioned, there was a loose link between these two cases over the years, with many theorizing that the Long Island serial killer and the Eastbound Strangler were one and the same. That whoever this was had killed in one area first, Atlantic City, and then moved south to the area around New York after his victims were discovered. In almost all online discussions about the case, this was a common thread speculated by many. Not only were all of the victims sex workers with known drug issues, but they all lived in the same general area. The distance between NYC and Atlantic City is a distance of a little more than 100 miles. It has also been theorized that some of the victims in both cases had known each other beforehand. However, there were some noticeable differences. The Lisk had contacted his victims through websites like Craigslist and Backpage, and kept a digital footprint. Meanwhile, the victims in the Eastbound Strangler case all worked on the street level, and likely encountered their killer that way. There was also a ritualistic nature to the Atlantic City crimes that was absent in the Gilgo Beach crimes, with the victims posed face down, facing east, with no socks or shoes. Meanwhile, the Lisk crimes felt more like informal dumps, with their bodies seemingly abandoned along the road. It's possible that this was an evolution of some kind, but it's even more likely that these are the actions of two separate killers. If Rex Heuermann is the Long Island serial killer, which I find likely, then it's possible that perhaps some other crimes in the area were committed by him. With Heuermann behind bars awaiting trial, detectives are investigating him for other potential crimes to see where he was and when. It's already known that his family was out of town at the same time that the 3 murder victims he's been charged with were killed. And if we extend that time frame back to 2006, was there maybe a chunk of time that he was staying in or near Atlantic City? Maybe a time that his architecture business brought him out for a few weeks. A couple of weeks ago, a spokesperson for Suffolk County PD told CBS News, investigators are looking into Heuermann in connection with cases around the nation, including Atlantic City, Las Vegas, and South Carolina. However, more recently, authorities in Atlantic City have stated that they do not believe Heuermann to be a suspect in the slayings attributed to the unidentified Eastbound Strangler, with investigators meeting with their Long Island counterparts to compare timelines, dates, methodologies, etc. But as stated by Atlantic County Prosecutor William Reynolds, there does not seem to be a connection. As of this recording, it does not seem like Rex Heuermann is being viewed as a potential suspect in the Eastbound Strangler case. But it's also worth pointing out that authorities in Atlantic County said the exact same thing about Terry Olesen while investigators were pouring through every inch of his personal life. It's possible that they're just continuing their tight-lipped approach to this case and refusing to name anyone a suspect unless they have to. Only time will tell, I guess. Over the years, many law enforcement agencies and officials have weighed in on the case in the media. Some were still working in law enforcement at the time, while others were retired or consulting, but they all helped contribute profiles for this unknown killer. Based on this collection of profiles, I think we can try and surmise some basic information about this still unidentified serial killer that will hopefully pay for his sins, at least one day. Based on the victims in this case, we can surmise that the killer was a white man from a lower to mid socioeconomic background who would not look out of place next to the victims. He likely lived in the same area, in particular the same area where their bodies were found in, Egg Harbor Township, just outside of Atlantic City. At least he felt comfortable enough to dispose of their remains in that area, and took a rather huge gamble returning at least a few times over many weeks. For that reason, this individual was likely a loner. He probably had problems with women before, maybe a mother or a spouse. Based on the posing of the victims, we can surmise that he had an interest in photography or another visual art, as many other killers that exhibited similar behaviors with their victims had an interest in visual arts of some kind. Because of how the victims were posed, it has been theorized that the killer had a foot fetish of some kind. John Kelly, a criminal profiler, told reporters with CBS News, "He's taken their shoes and he's taken their socks. I have to believe we're looking at a serial killer with a foot fetish here." Later, Kelly told reporters, "The reason we focused on the foot fetish is the way the women were posed. Their feet were on the embankment higher than their bodies." Sex workers that worked in the area at the time recall a couple of clients that had expressed an affinity for feet. Among them was Denise Hill, a sex worker that I quoted from earlier in this episode. She had described a dark-haired man with scraggly hair and a beer belly who had made odd comments about killing people and seemed to have an affinity for Denise's shoes and feet. She later identified this man as Eldred Raymond Burchell, who called himself the Riverman, an odd reference to the Green River Killer, Gary Ridgway, who killed sex workers for years in western Washington state. Burchell was reportedly in Atlantic City at the time of the killings and lived as a drifter, never staying in one place for long. It's unknown if he was ever identified as a suspect by police in this case, or even questioned. But if he truly did make those disturbing comments and had an affinity for feet, then that makes him as good a suspect as any. It has also been speculated by some that the killer might have been Muslim or Jewish, because all 4 of the victims were not wearing socks or shoes and were facing east at the time. Were they possibly posing east toward the Holy Lands? Since the killer remains unknown, it's hard to tell. Before we wrap up this episode, I have to talk about just one more suspect, who has the littlest amount of information currently available. 52 years old as of November of 2010, Dennis Gaskill lived in Egg Harbor Township, the same town where the 4 victims in this case had been found years prior. However, in November of 2010, Gaskill was in Kokomo, Indiana, attending a gun show. While there, he was arrested for stealing a gun. Afterward, authorities raided his home in New Jersey and discovered over 70 guns that he had stolen from similar gun shows in the past. As a previously convicted felon for mostly minor crimes, such as theft, he was unable to own firearms. However, Dennis Gaskill never answered why he had stockpiled these dozens of firearms in his home. While being extradited back to New Jersey from Indiana, Dennis Gaskill committed suicide by hanging himself with a piece of clothing inside of a jail cell. As reported by Howard County Sheriff Marty Talbert at the time, it's really more of a strangulation than a hanging. Despite there being very little information about Gaskill, he seems to have fit the profile of this unknown killer, which has been established by many law enforcement agents. As stated by Gary Britton, a retired homicide detective to my9nj.com, I found this individual to be one of the most bizarre human beings that I've ever encountered. He had drawings that he obviously did with his hand that would depict himself with both male and female genitalia holding weapons. His compulsive behavior, his obsessive-compulsive behavior came out in the neatness in which he kept his notebooks. You could see everything was in order. Sadly, because of the lives that the 4 victims were living at the time of their deaths, it's possible that we'll never know exactly what circumstances led them to encounter their killer or killers. That's really the sad, frustrating nature of these stories. At the end of the day, even if most of our questions get answered, we'll still be left wondering something. If not who, then with what, and where, and when, and how. But often, the question that never gets answered is, why? Why were these 4 women targeted? Why were they chosen to have their stories come to such a tragic end? Because they were living in the shadows of society, they were either forgotten or ignored by many of those around them, and some were not reported for days or weeks. In the case of those who were reported missing, they seemed to have been actively avoiding being found and were trying to run away from something, mistakes they'd made or regretted. These were mistakes that they would never get the chance to own up to or remedy, because their stories were ended at the hands of someone else who's escaped justice for 2 decades. All 4 of these victims left behind families and other loved ones, who have only been left with the uneasy feeling of not knowing how these women's lives came to an end, only that they did, snuffed out before their time by someone with an unknown motivation, who had abandoned their remains in a drainage ditch, but not before taking away their socks and shoes, lying them face down in inches of water, and then positioning their heads to face east. That's how they remember their loved ones. Maybe they can hold on to the happier memories from earlier in their lives, but at the end of the day, they're the ones that have had to endure this painful reminder of how these women were killed and callously abandoned. I can only hope that these loved ones have the support system that they need, and will hopefully, one day, get the resolution they so deserve. A private benefactor announced a $25,000 reward for information some time back, and that reward has gone unclaimed over many years. Nearly 17 years have passed since these 4 bodies were found near Atlantic City, and anyone with information is encouraged to reach out to the Atlantic County Prosecutor's Office at 609-909-7800. You can also contact Crime Stoppers at 609-652-1234. Or you can submit information anonymously to 1-800-658-TIPS. That's 1-800-658-8477. As of this episode's recording, the stories of Molly Jean Diltz, Barbara Brighter, Tracy Ann Roberts, and Kim Raffo remain unresolved.